Okay with the format? 7, 8 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion amongst ourselves.
Yes, sir.
I'll start pushing your buttons, special use.
You cut it.
I will cut it at 8, but then after that I will start pushing you and put you on the trial. And then we'll see the I had helped at Turkish.
You are busy? Alleine. We're definitely doing something. We're definitely doing something, and then we'll see what I think we have been better if we can get that game. There will be discontinuity. Balance up the things. So, welcome everyone. So the non-socializing part, or the socializing part, was already captured on camera. So if anyone is thinking of doing any crazy things, be advised that it's going to be broadcast. So I don't know if that's an incentive to do it or an incentive not to do anything crazy. But thank you for coming on this last day of March, and for our panel on modern Turkey. This year, Turkey will be celebrating its 100th centennial of the establishment of the Turkish Republic in October, with a lot of issues from now until then. It has been quite a busy, quite an eventful sort of couple of years, to say the least, regionally, but also for Turkey. We put together this panel, taking advantage of our fellow, visiting fellow, Cengiz Aktar, along with our two scholars, AUA in-house scholars who have written, thought about, and spoke about Turkey extensively. So we figured out that this would be a good opportunity to see if there have been any continuities or any ruptures between the Ottoman Empire and the Turkish Republic. The discussion, I hope, will be lively. We are going to be going with the format that we usually do. Each panelist will be having about 7-8 minutes of introductory remarks, their main points, after which we'll engage, I will try to engage, try being the operative word, my colleagues in a discussion amongst ourselves, and then we'll open up to Q&A. Having said that, I will give the first opportunity to Mike, who already has it, to Cengiz to start. And again, thank you everyone for coming and for your interest.
Asper, thank you. It's good to be here again. It was a long time, and the last time was at the occasion of the Centennial. And 8 years, the city has changed, the country has changed, and I don't want to comment on which direction, but it's something else. I'm living next to the Barajanov Museum, and there was nothing when I visited this museum 8 years ago around. Now it's full of buildings. It's good to be in Yerevan, in Armenia, and I take this opportunity to commemorate, and I will start there. Vahank Dadrian, the genocide scholar who passed away in 2019, and I understand he's buried here. And Dadrian wrote a piece in '98, in the Yale Journal of International Law. It's a very interesting article, and I would like to quote him. And he said he was comparing the Armenian genocide with the Shoah, with the Jewish Holocaust. And I quote him, he says, the shift in the international response from the acceptance of impunity, this is for the Armenian genocide, and this is embodied in the Lausanne Treaty, we may maybe talk about it, impunity, to the imposition of a retributive justice for Shoah. So this is, and he continues by arguing that, again quote him, the international desire to end the impunity and its legacy, the massacres of Armenians, served as a matrix for Nuremberg. So this is an extremely interesting piece, and Dadrian argues that, after the impunity of 1915, in 1945, the international community to go towards the other direction, and the impunity of the genocide towards the genocide, or vis-a-vis the genocide, has helped actually to put in place a new way of so-called retributive justice. So, indeed, he has a point. I mean, I have for those interested in the exact title of the article, I can share it if you like, if you want. Of course, he has a point. I mean, the Armenian genocide, but not only the Armenian genocide, all this ethno-religious cleansing, which started 1894 basically with the first Hamidian massacres until 1924, this 30 years of ethno-religious cleansing, which cleaned up kind of the Anatolia of its non-Muslim populations, has indeed went unaccounted for. It was unanswered. No one was punished except two poor kaymakams, who were hanged, and that is, of course, in connection with the Istanbul trials in 1919, as you know, and moreover, this non-event in the Turkish historiography, was dememorized, and it was intentional. So, is that the end of the story, or is that the end of the history with a capital H for all those who have suffered from this ethno-religious cleansing? I'm not sure. Of course, looking at the, in toto, when you look today, I mean, all these instigators and the culprits went away with it. I mean, this is the impression we all have. But is it the case, really? Is it really? Has what happened to the Turkish polity with the state and the society afterwards? Isn't there a kind of post facto retributive justice which happened afterwards? I think that the question is worth posing. I think four major dynamics emerged from this state of affairs. The first one is through the annihilation this ethno-religious annihilation, that equates to a huge loss of civilization, encompassing the entire country. I mean, when I say loss of civilization, it is about everything, including the way of baking, bread. It's the second outcome or consequence is as Republican Turkey choose to disremember the consequence, the consequent national amnesia perverted the sense of justice in the country, and also forbidden the learning from the past. There is no such a thing in Turkey. No one takes note of what has happened not only 100 years ago, but even 1 week ago. And it goes unaccounted because there is no responsibility. There is no one takes to him or her and accept to be, accountable for his or her deeds. The third dynamic is exactly this: the impunity for the instigators and the culprits. That has developed into a sort of culture of impunity in the country. You just get away with your crime, whatever the crime is. I mean, let me give you a rough example. I mean, what is the weight of of all these misdeeds by Erdogan to today? What is its weight with all the money he has stolen and so on, compared to the annihilation of 3 million Ottoman citizens in 30 years' time? It's peanuts. It's nothing. Why we should talk about that? In a society, in a polity which has swallowed, that huge, crime. And finally, probably one of the major consequences, which summarizes all, the country is characterized, the polity, the state and the society is characterized by a sort of contempt for the rule of law. The rule of law, we can discard it. It's not important. I mean, we have been discarding it for 100 years. Why we should take care of it now? This is, this entire sickness, I call it the Turkish malaise, and I wrote about that. I wrote a book that I offered at the library, and it will be translated most probably into Armenian, in Eastern Armenian. This malaise, this sickness is something really fundamental to understand today's Turkey, but also to establish this linkage between the empire and the republic. So there is a kind of post facto retributive justice that happened and that is happening. And the reason why today Turkey has extreme difficulties to become a normal country, a democratic country, is probably due to to this 100 years of amnesia and voluntary amnesia, which has perverted the country as a whole. I think I will stop there, Asmet.
Thanks a lot, Cengiz. I think very good and very thoughtful ideas. One thing that, and I know you choose your words carefully, it's not about forgetting, it's about disremembering. I think that is an issue. Our next two talks, Varak at some point is going to sort of follow on the same trajectory as Cengiz has mentioned, a couple of ideas. But in this issue of continuity and rupture, our next speaker, Varam, will actually be talking about the foreign policy, the Turkish foreign policy in terms of how it has been influenced by the past, the trajectories that the past has dictated, and the new paths that have developed. Varam.
Thank you very much. I have to say, Cengiz, it's very nice, very glad to have you here, and I guess the fact that we have been offered chairs here, like these soft chairs, it's never happened before, so this is an occasion to celebrate, so this is in your honor. So what I want to say in the 7 minutes that I have been allocated is the following. First of all, Turkish historiography has done miracles for that country. Turkish historiography has paved the way for sort of interpretations that were so successful in many corners in the world that until the 1970s and 60s, only few could dare to challenge some of the established interpretations of the Turkish historiography. One of these successful approaches is about the established interpretation of Turkish foreign policy. Those who know Turkish history, who have been traveled to Turkey, know the famous slogan that is met quite often on many buildings is "Peace at home, peace in the world." This famous saying sounds very nice to many ears. It projects a message that this is a peaceful country. It lives peacefully with the neighbors. They strive for peace, and that has been the dominant trend of that country since day one of the establishment of that country. But in reality, just the opposite has occurred during the 100 years of Turkish existence. If you look at 10 decades of Turkish Republic, out of these 10 decades, during these 5 decades, Turkey had territorial expansion. In the 1920s, Turkey territory has been expanded as a result of Kars Treaty and Moscow treaties. In the 1930s, Turkish territory has been expanded as a result of an accord with Iran in Saadabad Pact. And the results we can see from the window here, how the Lesser Arad became part of Turkey. In the 1940s and 50s, in the 1940s, Turkey was very close to have the opposite when the Soviet Union presented territorial demands to Turkey. 1950s, there was some time for reflection. 1960s, Cyprus started, and then in 1974, Turkey had another territorial expansion of occupying 38% of Cyprus territory. In the 1980s, we see Turkey recognizing Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, basically the only country that has recognized the Republic of Cyprus. We come to the 1990s, the 2000s, and then 2010s. We see again Turkey has occupied the territory of Iraq, northern part of Iraq, and the territory of Syria, as we know it today. So this entire myth that the Turkish historiography and politicians have created, that Turkey is a peaceful country, just seeking to live with its neighbors, is just a big myth. If you compare with the established territory of October 19th, 1923, and if you compare it with what Turkey has now, Turkey's territory has expanded quite a bit. So this is one layer of foreign policy that I want to say. So the second one is after the 1990s, the logic in the Turkish historiography is that it was only after the 1990s that Turkish foreign policy became more aggressive, more forward-looking. It's not the case. Look at the 1930s. I forgot to mention about the occupation of Hatay, Alexandria Sancak. So if we look at this, we see that Turkish foreign policy and militarist foreign policy projection has been there for decades. What we see nowadays, a more militarized engagement outside of Turkish immediate neighborhood. This is quite unprecedented on many aspects. We see Turkish military presence in the regions which Turkey had only historical memory of, like in Libya, like in the Gulf region, and in the Red Sea region. So Turkey, like 50 years ago, Turkish politicians could only imagine that kind of expansion, but it's not the case. Now it is a reality. If you go to Qatar, you talk to Qatar's politicians, in their mind, the security of Qatar cannot be maintained without the influence of Turkey and Turkish military presence in Qatar. And the same is in Libya, is in Syria. Turks believe that without Turkish presence, in the northern part of Syria, the security can be undermined, and so on and so forth. So Turkish foreign policy, militarization of Turkish foreign policy has been a tradition, as it was the case 100 years ago, and it's also a continuation that we see now. So some of the arguments that we hear, especially nowadays, that with the results of Turkish foreign policy, if Kılıçdaroğlu, let's say, wins the elections, it's going to be overhauled. These are simplistic assertions, and it goes against the logic of history and the history of Turkish Republic. And the last point that I want to make on Turkish foreign policy is to make sure that their borders are all the borders that Turkey has with all its neighbors have legal acknowledgement by all parties that are neighbors of Turkey. If you look at Turkish foreign policy documents, it's interesting how persistent they are in terms of maintaining each time in any document about the importance of referring to an historical document. No document between Turkey and Azerbaijan, between Turkey and Georgia, is signed without a reference to the Kars Treaty, which, as you know, is a very sensitive topic for Armenians. And Armenian foreign policy has been quite consistent on this, that we don't like to have a reference on the Kars Treaty, but Turkey has constant reference for Kars Treaty when it comes to any document that is signed between Turkey and Azerbaijan, Turkey, and Georgia. And as you know, this year also marks the 100th anniversary of the Lausanne Treaty, which is a significant document in Turkish history because it marks the borders that Turkey has with the Middle Eastern countries and the European countries. So I'm sure you have heard many many assertions available in by some experts that after 100 years, the Lausanne Treaty is going to be nullified. I don't know where that myth was injected, but this kind of approach also is coming from, sometimes Erdogan also tries to re-establish the discourse, and sometimes to come to reinvigorate the discourse, saying that, well, yeah, not entirely, but perhaps the provisions about the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits could be modified within that context. So the last remark, territorial dimension of Turkish foreign policy has been there. It's has been very sensitive for Turkey, and is going to dominate in Turkish foreign policy undertakings for the coming future. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Vara. Quite interesting points. Already I'm seeing how the discussion is going to go in terms of, we're talking more about continuity than ruptures, with sort of basically examples of ruptures rather than a whole sort of rupture from the past. It always reminds me of both when Cengiz was talking and Varam, it's like the title that keeps coming to my mind is The Empire Strikes Back. I know I stole it from George Lucas, but it does have an imperial element, an imperial approach on issues, be that foreign policy or internal. Next, we have Varak, who's going to touch upon some of the issues that were mentioned at the beginning, especially the issue of homogenization and creating the plan, the project maybe, that the modern Turkish Republic was going to have, and how there are sort of identity issues or clashes in terms of reconciliation issues. So I'm not going to keep talking, Barak. I know you'll have more on this. So please, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Asbet, for the introduction, and it really is an honor to be on this panel. So, Asbet, thank you for bringing that point up that the empire strikes back. I know all of you have probably heard that President Erdogan is trying to revive the Ottoman Empire as Putin is trying to revive the Soviet Union. So this is pretty fashionable, at least in the last decade. So from a historian's perspective, I'm just trying to unpack what that means for Turkish domestic politics and not specifically for Turkish foreign policy. And I do see some continuities between the empire and the long Turkish Republican traditions. So in a way, Erdogan is not trying to revive the Ottoman Empire from the points that I'll be making, but in itself is re-implementing some of the policies that were present during the imperial times. And what do I mean by these? First, Turkish identity, at least in the last 10 decades, has never been an inclusive identity. It has always been an exclusive identity that has been shaped in contradistinction to other ethno-religious groups, ethnic groups that do not necessarily conform to Kemalist and later on Sunni Muslim identity or the typography of an identity. So that's very important to keep in mind, because for all the decades that we have looked at in the last few years, there is an element of violence. And I think this goes back to Vahram's point. If Vahram said, for the last 10 decades, Turkey has always had some kind of a territorial expansion, I would add to that for the last 10 decades, there hasn't been a single decade where we do not see any violence against any specific group living in the Turkish Republic. Whether that group are the Greeks, Jews, Armenians, Alevis, Kurds, or any other group living in the Republic. So what do we mean by this? Is that when we look at the continuities between an empire and the republic in 2023, we do see the persistence of structures of violence, and that's a very important point to understand Turkish domestic politics. I do not want to go into essentialist argument saying Turks are always violent, but we do see the way in which the republic has been structured, has been shaped. Those structures of violence, whether it's the army, other militia groups, or even the state itself, is engaged in practices of violence. So going back to what Professor Akhtar said about creating this environment of impunity, but also creating an environment in which a certain part of the population always feels marginalized, discriminated against, and eventually targeted. When you look at the 1920s all the way to 2020s, you see different groups being targeted for different practices of violence. So when we look at how the last decades of the empire unfolded, we do see similarities between what the Turkish state, whether the Kemalist state or the state that President Erdogan has created. It's always a matter of securitizing different ethno-religious communities. And that's something that we see consistently from the 1880s until the 2020s. And this is actually justified by different ideologies. We do not necessarily ascribe that to nationalism, but Islamism can be used for the securitization of ethno-religious communities. Turkism can be used for that. Nationalism or Kemalism can be used for that. So in that respect, we do see many similarities between the last decades of the empire and the current situation in Turkey. And as a historian, I just wanted to conclude with two parallels, in a way, between what was happening in the last decades of the empire and between what we see today. So in 1908, as many of you probably would know, there was a kind of revolution against the autocratic regime of Sultan Abdulhamid II. And if you look at the coalition of forces who were against Abdulhamid. It included Arabs, it included liberal Turks, it included young Turk members, it included Armenians. So in many ways, I do actually make some parallels between the situation today and between the situation in 1908. For all of these elements in 1908, the ultimate goal was to actually oust or depose Abdulhamid II without necessarily having any future plan on what the empire would be or how the empire would be. And I think today, if you look at the Turkish opposition, you see a coalition of different forces coming from the far right to center left, more Islamist-leaning parties to more secular-leaning parties. And I do think that that is also a problem because these parties are really fixated on how to actually topple Erdogan and not necessarily presenting or actually having any type of a future plan for a more inclusive Turkish society. And I think I just want to conclude on that point because, again, we see some kind of a missed opportunity for a new Turkish social contract that would be much more inclusive than what the Republican legacy and the imperial legacy has left the Turkish population. Thank you.
Great. Well, wonderful. A lot of food for thought. One thing I think, and the historians among this in this panel, might also testify or attest to it, is that we usually think of ruptures or like when we talk about Turkey was an empire until 1923 and then became a republic, as if it's like history has an expiration date and a starting date, events in history, rather than thinking that there are a lot of spillover effects, be that cultural, political, social, mentality-wise, and so on. Just because in this part of the world Armenia became independent in 1991 doesn't mean that the Soviet influence or the empire is gone. And I think this is a point that we need to keep in mind, especially in this discussion when we're talking about continuities. And in this respect, I do want to raise a couple of issues and get the feedback of our panelists on that. First of all, well, what do you think about this, actually, the issue of the spillover? Are these two completely different animals? The empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Turkish republics? You did talk about Cengiz, about disremembering. Vadam did talk about continuity of imperialism, imperial policy. I mean, for all, I would reword what Vadam said with his approval. Militarization of foreign policy is not a way of saying imperialism. So there must be some kind of an empire mentality there. And the same thing goes with what Vadam was saying in terms of having the imperial structure where minorities, even though less now than they used to be, there's still that sort of the same coalition and precipitation. So any thoughts about this? We'll go on.
Thanks. Be it empires or kingdoms, there's always a continuity between the so-called ancien regime and the post-ancien regime, like Alexis de Tocqueville. I mean, the French Revolution, of course, was an extremely important event, but there has been, very enduring, continuities between the royalist France and the Republican France. And the same goes for Russia. The same goes for the Ottoman Empire, for sure. I think what is important, in terms of political sociology, is to jot and to really to figure out which are those continuities continue to mark, actually to determine the very existence of the post-imperial or the post-royal states. Yeah, sure. Okay. As far as Turkey is concerned, or Russia, by the way, I mean, they are very strong, and they are very. I mean, there has been several, examples, both in terms of foreign policy but also in terms of, the behavior, the political behavior of the various actors in the country, in Turkey. And I like very much the Varak's comparison between 1908 and to today. It's really to the point, because it's in those days everybody all existing political forces in the Ottoman Empire, dying, ailing Ottoman Empire, was to get rid of Abdülhamit II, exactly like today. From extreme right to extreme left, the Turkish politicians want to get rid of Recep Tayyip Erdogan without being capable of saying a single word about the days after. The days after, what will happen the next day? Will the new social contract that Barak was talking about is there? I mean, is there any indications
the
about
nature of revolution?
is the indication? Which
Of getting rid of someone and rarely think about what comes afterwards.
But exactly. I mean, the terminology that is used in Turkey today is fascinating. I'm sure Barak is aware of that. People are using the word istibdat. And istibdat means absolutism. It's an Arabic word, and it was used in 1908, and they are using exactly the same word after more than 100 years, which tells us that at the end of the day, when it comes to the dynamic of the political microcosmos in that country, not really much happened, really. Because it means that there is something wrong, and I mean, I started to give some indications about what is wrong and why it doesn't work and why it will not work. Because one of the consequences that I try to explain, and I try to give you a network of to understand really what is wrong with Turkey is this. The contempt for the rule of law, the dememorization, the entire denial, the way of pushing around the rule of law, and all that have a consequence regarding all ethno-religious, I wouldn't say even minorities. I mean, because they were not minorities, 100 years ago. And Alevis today and Kurds today are not minorities, but that brings us, or pulls us, calls upon us about the very concept of the equality, about among the citizens, and this is something that it's a sickness that exists in all powerful states. And they don't want to share their power. They don't want to share their power neither for their neighbors nor with their own citizens if they feel that the citizens are different. And they don't accept the difference, or they accept only the definition of the citizenship that they describe, full stop. And this is where we are. And this lack of empathy and the refusal to share power, this is directly related to this, to the past of the country, to the contempt for the rule of law, and to sort of fear that the majority of the population, in its DNA, kind of, is afraid of becoming also a minority one day. So this takes us to the culture of lynch in Turkey. This is very common, and it's no one wants to appear as an Armenian, and there's a very or Greek or Rum, by the way. There's an interesting say of Erdogan that you noticed probably one day, and he said, "I'm sorry. They even say that I'm Armenian." That means something. It's not a coincidence. It tells you that the fear of being treated as an Armenian, and this goes for all the public figures in the country, not also only vis-a-vis the Armenians, but all ethno-religious groups which don't fit with the definition of what should be the content of the citizenship. Mm-hmm. So this is, it's there. I mean, it won't change from tomorrow.
How about from a foreign policy perspective in terms of that vectors, imperial versus republican?
That is also visible in a very apparent way. Let's take the example of a document which was adopted in January 1920, famously known as Misakamilli, or National Pact. If you look at the map and the borders of that document, it's quite fascinating how that kind of thinking still dominates in Turkish political thinking and discourse. Misakamilli is seen in the general nationalist discourse in Turkey as an uncompleted task that it's a job of the generations in Turkey to get it completed. Those of you who don't know what is Misakamilli National Pact, it's a very ambitious map that stretches all the way to Batumi and Mosul in Iraq, and Batumi region in Georgia, all the way to Cyprus, and then to southeastern part of Europe, in Greece and Bulgaria. In the national mindset of nationalism, that is an unfulfilled dream, and from time to time you see how nationalists in Turkey, national circle, ultra-nationalists who choose, refer to that dream as something that has yet to be completed, has yet to be finalized. So 1920 document, Misakamilli, is an important, helpful document to understand some of the discourses. So the second one is continuation of politicians that were serving in the Ottoman Empire in the 1910s and early 1920s, and how they continued to serve in the government and in different positions until late 70s. There's in my book on Kemalism, I describe that part, how a famous diplomat in the foreign ministry of Turkey, how he was describing in his memoirs his encounters in the 1920s and 30s, his encounters with Kemal Atatürk. And that book was published in 1977 when he was still alive. Just imagine the continuities that he has seen. I mean, let's say a number of high-ranking officials in the Ottoman Empire in the 1910s were still serving in Turkish politics, in Celal Bayar, let's say, or others were also part of the genocide, planning the genocide. So these people were enjoying the fruits of environment of impunity and trying to benefit from the system that they themselves have created. So this entire myth that 1923 is a break, is a clean slate that they have started, and this different Turkey, it's a myth, and there is no manifestation. There is no serious argument can be even about this, and it was that has established even in the Western historiography, in the Western approaches, especially this modernization theory has dominated that approach. It was influenced by that so much that only in Erik Jan Surger and others, when they started to write that, we see the young Turks present in the Turkish political circles all the way to the 1920s and 1940s and 50s and 60s. So let's not buy that argument that with Turkish modernization we see a new brand of politicians coming, Kemalist politicians coming and changing the course of Turkish development. And the last point, when we talk about Turkish continuation between the Ottoman Empire and the Turkish Republic, we have to see some of the practices when it comes to homogenization and with ethnic minorities. We see the same kind of fascist, racial, and apartheid practices. And more importantly, we see how these practices are exported. And Azerbaijan is a prime example of that. How Azerbaijan is learning and has learned from the Turkish experience of creating a homogenized society, a polity, how they are creating the image of an enemy and multiple enemies, and how that helps to solidify the national discourse. So this mutual learning, and Turks themselves have learned from Germany in the beginning of the 20th century, how Germany was using these practices of violence against civilians in Africa, how Germans themselves have learned from Turkey during the genocide, and how Germany against Nazis have learned from the Ottomans, from Turks when they were doing the Holocaust. So there is this great deal of continuity. There is no way any argument, any historian can come up, even nowadays, it's all sort of an absolute consensus that historical thinking is gone, it's obsolete, it has no place in the historiography when it comes to interpretation of Turkish history of the 20th century.
Just a point of clarification, it's quite interesting, the examples that you gave, you didn't mention Mustafa Kemal himself being part of that continuity, right? I mean, he's the epitome of that continuity, right?
I'm so tired of him, so sometimes I forget to mention him.
I know, that is the but no, really, I mean, I think this is also something to keep. I mean, the foundations of Republic, Kemalism is, he himself, is byproduct of Ottoman Young Turk movement. So obviously, unless you have schizophrenia and multiple identities, and he said, I got rid of my former identity, I don't think that might have been the case. What about your take in terms of the societal imperial versus Republican continuity?
Well, Bahram's earlier point about the signing of any treaties that always or necessarily include a historical reference point actually made me think about the importance of history in the Turkish Republic and in Turkish society, at least to the countries I've been in, to the societies I've studied. Turkish society is, in a way, not only fascinated by history, but obsessed by history. I mean, we know as Armenians are also fascinated and obsessed by history, but it's a different level of obsession in Turkey. And I think in that respect, none of the governments, whether in the first few decades of the Republic or under the AKP rule, they always make reference to Ottoman history. So although the Ottoman Empire was collapsed, declined, is gone for more than 100 years now, but it's coming back in different ways, mostly through what I would call the weaponization of history, weaponization of Ottoman history in the Turkish Republic. And that's the point that relates to this myth that the President Erdogan is reviving the Ottoman Empire, because at every step that he's making, especially for domestic politics, he tries to find something from Ottoman history in order to justify his future actions or his current actions. So whether it's the Kemalists or followers of Erdogan, Ottoman history is very much present, and it's a very flexible history that gives these two sides some kind of tools to use for current political projects. I mean, for the Kemalists, the Ottomans have always been the Turks gone wrong, the Turks gone bad. So the Republic has been a kind of a rectification of that. Whereas for Erdogan and people from his kind of surroundings, the Kemalists were a hiccup in Turkish history. The Ottomans were the good Turkish Muslims. So in that respect, there's always a constant reference to Ottoman history. And it's not really a coincidence that in the last 10 years or so, for those of you who have visited Turkey, Ottoman insignia, emblems, portraits of sultans have been really ubiquitous in pretty much everywhere. And Erdogan has been using this Ottoman tolerant discourse of Muslims living together to actually project power on the Arab world and on the Muslim world as well. So in a way, it not only ties to domestic politics, but it's also kind of an ideological cement for his foreign policy as well.
Yeah, it's before giving the floor to Adam and then Cengiz as well to comment about this. I think that's like a potential of an HBO show, right? Turks Gone Bad, Turks Gone Wild, or something along those lines. But this weaponization of history is quite interesting. You see that in Iran under Reza Pahlavi, arguing that the Muslim period was just a hiccup, and then we're the ancient Zoroastrians. We see that in Russia as well. Something to think about for future. If there has been any research, I would love to read about this as well. Why in Russia, Turkey, and Iran, and not in Spain, or in Austria, or in England, in terms of weaponizing it? But, sorry.
Yeah, just a quick note, because we have a Q&A session coming up. So, Erdogan himself mentioned a few times, I'm sure you know that, for him, the source of inspiration, he said it publicly, is Abdulhamid II. For him, he's a cult. He gets his inspiration from the second. So he tells a lot about the kind of that. And we all remember Erdogan's statement, his speech in Baku on December 10th of 2020, when he was talking about the continuation of Enver's dream, what the Azerbaijani army, according to his interpretation, did was a continuation of Pasha's dream from the First World War.
But that in itself is a very interesting contradiction from someone who's taking inspiration from Abdülhamid and then quoting Enver Pasha. I don't know how he would reconcile
and
that.
I keep saying that Erdogan is remained throughout his career not very well versed in history. No, I mean, look at his statements, and that guy doesn't know history at all.
Cengiz?
Does he know anything else? No, but he's a political animal. Come on. He's a dangerous political animal. Anyhow, but history is in the hands of nation states as an instrument to be used and abused since 200 years. I mean, it's nothing new and revolutionary to say this really, and it depends how much it can serve and where it leads, etc. When it comes to the Turks and the neo-Ottomanism, I don't think Erdogan is the right figure to quote. Of course, he's the boss and he runs the show basically, but I mean, he is a parochial fellow. I mean, he has no idea about what he's talking about, and he has a very poor education, and he has been under. I mean, he started to talk about this kind of things under the influence of this Ahmet Davutoğlu. When he was his advisor, yes, and then Minister of Foreign Affairs, and then the Prime Minister. So, but again, I think it goes for many empires. I mean, which Ottoman Empire we are talking about? There's a total mix in Turkey about this. Are we talking about the Ottoman Empire of the 15th, 16th century and the Pax Ottomanica, like Pax Romana? I mean, these empires had, a historical function. When I say Pax, it really means Pax. It means that people can live and without any fear of being depleted from their goods. This is what this is what it means. I mean, the Pax Romana. I'm not saying that there was no duress. I'm not saying that everything was smooth and peaceful, etc. But there was a relative peace, so that people could live, and without fearing that some pirates or anyone else will come and take, their belongings, their family, their husbandry, etc. So this is something else. This is these are the 15th, 16th century, the Ottoman Empire, and it had indeed, fulfilled this task after the Byzantine Empire and before that the Persian Empire in the region, etc. But when we talk about the Ottomans of the 19th century, This is something else. This is the era of the nation states and the national demands and the national, upheavals, the nationalism, etc. I mean, it's totally different than the Ottoman Empire of the 15th, 16th century. You cannot compare it. So
To think about the Ottoman Empire as a revolutionary empire is something that not a lot of people relate to, but sometimes I do mention that the millet system at the time was a revolutionary idea, where empires oppressed minorities. Here you have the Ottoman Empire. Again, we like to generalize, good or bad. It's always been good, then it always will remain good. If it is bad now, it has always been bad. I would like to, again, one final sort of a set of thoughts from the panelists before we open up for discussions. Maybe this time we'll start with Vara. What about institutions? Institutions that either solidify, change, have they changed in terms of creating that homogeneity? In the case of Varam already touched upon it in terms of the foreign policy institution, which Erdogan to a large extent dismantled, but also in terms of polity. Do we see institutions modernized yet the same? Or it's the same way that they have been working, the same way they operated? What? He's used to be the third one, so that would give him time to prepare.
I think, well, from the top of my head now, I think one of the institutions that I see continuities in is the role, or the changing role of the army in Turkish domestic and foreign policy. So if we go back to the last decades of the empire, and then this kind of young Turk involvement in imperial management and administration, we see an officer class actually coming to power. And that pretty much continued in Turkey all the way to the early 2000s, where under different circumstances and conditions and different factors, the army was in a way obliged to withdraw from domestic politics. However, having said that, there's also an interesting twist here, because, okay, we see that continuity in the Republican times. The army has always been the institution that defined security targets, that defined security issues, that really securitized ethno-religious communities and minorities. And now that the army has withdrawn from politics, now it's the state actually that's doing that. It's Erdogan doing that instead of the army. I'm not saying the army is not complicit in that, but those targets or that securitization is mostly being done by the civilian authority rather than the army. So,
did you intentionally say state versus army? Because you said the army is not doing it, it's the state that doing it.
I meant the civilian authority.
Oh, okay. Because that would have created a whole new discussion. But thank you. Vara, what about the foreign policy institution itself?
No, obviously the foreign ministry continued with a different name. But I want to, in terms of institutions, it's interesting how some of the institutions in the late Ottoman Empire were transformed everything only by name. So let's say Diyanet, right? The Diyanet became this institution, Directorate of Religious Affairs, that was created in 1924. That institution became has the most significant, perhaps one of the most significant missions of any institution in Turkey, and has kept that mission intact for many, many decades. So next year it will be the 100th anniversary of that institution. So Diyanet's job was basically to control the religious policy. Basically, what's going on in the country has to be approved by Diyanet. Moreover, now Diyanet has expanded its area of functioning. Now, Foreign Ministry of Turkey, all the embassies of Turkey abroad, they need to have a religious attaché. In most of the embassies, let me be very clear. So which means what? The Diyanet, that has been the toolbox, toolbox in the hands of Atatürk at the beginning of his rule, has transformed into something. This has become a powerful institution in Turkey that is now power that extends. The second institution is, of course, political parties. in Turkey. So that the ones that were immersed in the 900s, in the early 900s, they were transformed, renamed, reformed, and with only CHP's name is mentioned as old, is kind of the founding party of Turkey, but the CHP is an amalgam of many, a synergy of many functions of many political parties. So it's a political parties, institutions, the army, Diyanet, and the practices. So when we talk about, you can change the name of the institution, but the practices, they continue. One thing that I forgot to mention, you know, when Barak says that history has a different dimension in Turkey, that's an absolutely important statement. And there is a study. In 1999, the German Foundation did a research asking middle school kids in Turkey, what is the most important subject that you study in Turkey? And they said history. And by that, they're on the top of those societies for whom history is more than just history. Thank you.
Cengiz, what about the issue that you were talking about, especially the issue of polity and as well as the structure of the impunity and so on? Do you see any institutional continuity that continues the impunity at an institutional level, or the polity at an institutional level? Transform or continue?
You know, the avatar of impunity is irresponsibility. So it's, of course, I mean, you are first irresponsible, and at the end of the day, I mean, you don't pay anything. You know, you get away with it, and this is how the institutions function in Turkey, and since 1923, by the way. So there is. In that, I don't know if we can talk about the continuity, because this, for me, really the major earthquake, political earthquake for those lands is this 30 years of ethno-religious cleansing. Everything has changed after that. So this, I think, in my political thinking, I cannot disregard this 30 years. This is absolutely key. I mean, the foreign ministry that Bahram was talking about, this was created in 1840. So sorry, it's almost 200 years old institution, and there are many institutions have been taken from the Ottoman Empire and continued, which is normal. I mean, in many countries after not only in Turkey, but there are some institutions who continued in the other post-Ottoman states, like Syria, for instance. They still use some of the Ottoman institutions. Anyhow, this is not the topic. But what happened now with more or less this way of functioning of the state institutions, the key institutions, army, the administration of the territory, the academia, the economic affairs, and the foreign policy, and the judiciary. That six top institutions exist in every country, and which makes they make all these countries to function, to run. I mean, so there has been a major transformation of all these institutions the last 10 years. Literally the last 10 years, starting in 2013, and which has accelerated with the presidentialization of the regime in 2017 and 2018. So all this quite old and very when I say old, I mean they have an institutional memory. All these institutions have been transformed like never before, and I think we should understand this. And it fits with what Bahram was saying about the Turkish foreign policy. Of course, it's no, this peace at home, peace in the world is is a kind of smoke screen. But with this transformation of the last 10 years, all these institutions have become kind of obedient servants of the presidential palace. So they have been kind of emptied from their early functions. Just to take the example of the foreign ministry, 1840, this institution doesn't exist anymore. I mean, the best stuff has left. The men asked for an early retirement, literally, and only the average people remained. And the decisions, the key decisions of the foreign policy in Turkey, or the key decisions for the matter of the economic affairs, for instance, what will be the interest rate? Who will be the governor of, Kars, for instance, and who will lead the Supreme Electoral, Council, which is a key institution nowadays, etc. And who will be the rector or the president of this or that university? Every single decision is taken by the presidential palace, all of them, without exception, and these institutions are not asked for their opinion. What do you think? I mean, we are sending this one there, and what do you think of, no, nothing. I mean, there are small clusters for the foreign affairs. There are 13 guys. It's called the Council of Security and Foreign Policy. They are sitting in the presidential palace. They pretend to be the specialists and very knowledgeable people, not at all. And but they decide, and the head of each council, because there's a council for each each topic. The head of each council is, of course, Erdogan. And there's a deputy head, and who is running the daily, exercise for foreign affairs is Ibrahim Kalın, for instance. He's the deputy, but the boss is Erdogan, the final decision. So what I mean is that these institutions have been inherited from the Ottoman Empire. They were functioning more or less with all the structural and fundamental illnesses that the polity had, but now the last 10 years they have become something else.
I think it's an issue of adaptation at first and now transformation. I mean, you use the word transformation.
Absolutely, but one last example is the army. Okay, the army, the Turkish army, under the influence and the impetus of the process for the EU process, the army should have no say in an EU country. Okay, we know that. And the best example of this civilization of the army was undertaken by Spain, after Franco. So the same has been asked to the candidate country Turkey, exactly like for other candidate countries to the EU. They did it, indeed. They have civilized. So now the military top brass obey the elected officials, but instead of becoming an army of the state, it has become the army of the regime. So these are two different things. The army obeys Erdogan, not the state. So what may happen? Imagine what may happen if by chance and by miracle the opposition wins. Exactly.
Dismantling again of the institution. I can continue. We'll open the floor for some questions. Please ask your questions to any specific speaker. The others will participate as well. But before I do that, I remember in 2015-16, I was having a conversation in Ankara with a friend, and who made the argument that Erdogan is becoming to emulate Atatürk in many, many ways, trying to be that as the father of the nation, taking care of the poor, construction, and he said the only thing that is missing that Atatürk had was a war, winning a war. And I kept thinking about that in 2020 war, because he actually, the Karabakh war, that probably also sold that as his become Ghazi as well as Atatürk was. Quite interesting to see again the emulation of history, how to emulate and how to recreate images. So questions for any? Okay, let's start from this side and move in the back. Do we have a microphone?
Yes.
We can do that.
As it was mentioned today, Turkey has intervened in many conflicts and started many conflicts around the world in the region, and keeps its impunity. In the previous century, it could be understandable by the lack of international organizations and institutions, like the occupation of Hatay province, for example. But what do you think now is the reason why Turkey has this impunity, intervening and invading the neighbors? Thank you.
Let's collect a couple of questions, and then we'll answer. We'll do in clusters.
Thank you so much for the discussion. It was an honor to be here. I wanted to ask to what extent it was reasonable to put the question of the Armenian Genocide recognition as the cornerstone of Armenia's foreign policy, considering that it made Nagorno-Karabakh a peaceful, possible resolution under a serious threat and resulted over. Thank you very much.
Anyone from this part of the room? We'll be getting. We'll stop there as the first round. So we'll go back.
So yeah, I'm gonna ask in Turkish specific to you, Dr. Akhtar. Şimdi benim gözlemlediğim kadarıyla.
Go in English because not everyone
Okay.
speaks Turkish.
Okay. So what I've seen, like these three centuries, not just this part of century of like Osmanlı era and then the Atatürk's era, which they basically formed the Turkish Republic based on secularism. Can we say that now it's the era of the Erdogan because, like, again, we're seeing something new and something different? Thank you.
This would need a lot of content, especially what Barak was talking about. Yes, and then.
Thank you for an interesting discussion, and I would like to hear the panelists' opinions on what we should expect from the current Turkish-Armenia talks, if we should expect something substantial, and if, with a big if, Erdogan should lose the elections, will that have an impact on Armenia-Turkish relations and the current process that has been set in motion? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the beautiful panel that we are witnessing. My question is, maybe you have answered indirectly, but this is it. We are witnessing nowadays a revival of Pan-Turanism in sort of. Do you think that by the democratization of Turkey, this dream, this ideology is going to be resigning? I mean, they will resign from this ideology, or it will continue, as the panel was discussing, the continuity of the foreign policy of Turkey.
Anyone who's ready to go first on the panel? In a cluster to ask? Yeah.
Okay. So as for the immunity regarding this external interventions of actually the last 10 years, by the way. I mean, it started really, it concentrated on this last decade. So what is the bottom line for the West, for Turkey's classical strategic allies? What is it? It's NATO membership against Russia. That's the bottom line. And they can excuse anything and everything Ankara and Erdogan does, as long as Turkey remains in the alliance. This is it. I mean, they can close the eyes to the occupation of Syrian lands, to to the involvement in Artsakh, in Karabakh War, to the de facto occupation of the Western Libya, to continued interventions in Iraq, etc., and the threats against Greece. So they can excuse anything as long as Turkey remains in NATO. This is, as far as, and this is the so-called appeasement policy. I mean, this is appeasement, but appeasement never goes alone. Appeasement means always empowerment, indirectly. And this is what happened the last 10 years. Now we will see and how and if that continues. So this Erdogan era, this man has really transformed the country. This is, something that the external observers have sometimes difficulty to understand. I mean, Turkey has been transformed like never before. I'm not saying that it has become a religious country or something. It has become really something else. And for the first time in the history of the Republic, probably, this man, despite whatever he does, and all the wrongs he does and he did until today, is still supported exactly like Hitler and Stalin by at least 30% of the population. This is totalitarianism. Hannah Arendt, read Hannah Arendt, without the support of the masses, totalitarian leaders cannot survive. And this is exactly what is happening. And the latest polls to today about Erdogan, and they are crystal clear. I mean, the country has collapsed in a way, by all means, economically speaking, politically speaking, morally speaking. And the man has still 30% of the vote. In a normal democratic country, I mean, we would have gone already. What is the what are my predictions about the day after? If by miracle this opposition wins, I mean, this 30% won't go away. They won't evaporate. They are there. It's exactly like post 1945 Germany. It needs denazification. Yeah. It needs a sort of denazification because this is the real transformation. I mean, many people, neighbors of Turkey, like Greece is a very good example. They consider that what is happening in Turkey the last 10 years is a simple deviation from the norm. It is not. It is something very deep, and it won't change from day one to day two. And this is what they don't want to understand. And so it will take time. And with this opposition, it may take even more time because they have no policy. So related to it, the Panturanism, just to give you, a comical example. I mean, they keep, gathering this Turkic states summit. They don't talk Turkish there. Huh? Everybody speaks the language he or she knows. They are mainly men, so they know. And all these Central Asian states, they speak Russian. And there is a translation, what Turkic states? I mean, there's no such a thing. The only country who really speaks a proper Turkish, understandable, is the Azeris. And now we have this joker, and the dangerous joker, the Orban, who pretends to be of Turkic origin, who's attending the summits. Anyhow. But the only danger there, of course, and this, in case of victory by Erdogan, we may see a development of, a kind of flirting more with the Shanghai Cooperation Council. This is definitely in the cards. It will be difficult. It needs for Turkey to leave NATO, and whether the polity is ready to go. I mean, to make this big leap. because it's very dangerous. This Shanghai Cooperation Council, it's not a security organization. It's not like NATO, it doesn't protect you. So I don't know how much they know about this, and that's presidential palace. But so otherwise, all these Turkic, Panturinist, whatever moves, frankly, I mean, it's just show off. I mean, it's nothing serious behind it. And of course, there is this talk about the Turkish highway, or the Turkic highway, as you may know, through the Armenian territory, it's unique, etc. If, so on, etc. So that brings me to the normalization talks. Whether this will be, an issue in the normalization talks, I don't know. And but I also know that it won't be something that Yerevan can, accept. But what the normalization talks, whether it's the present regime or the opposition, I think the foreign policy will remain national, and they will try to go, if they manage to convince Baku, that try to go for a formula of just opening the door, the land borders, and that's it. And the trading here and there, but more than that, frankly, I don't see Ankara being capable of anything else. But I'm sure that there are other observations on that. Thank you.
Let me start with the most difficult question that Janusz has raised, and I'll tie that question to Otev's question. So, as you know, Armenia and Turkey agreed to open up the Armenian-Turkish checkpoints on the border ahead of the tourist season for the country, for the citizens of the third country. I don't know whether that's going to happen. I have serious doubts. And on July 1st, when that was announced last year, I raised a number of concerns publicly about the implications that it can have. And until now, these concerns are valid. They're still there. And but the most distressing and most disturbing thing for me, Janusz, is how the Turkish-Armenian border, if one day it opens the checkpoints, how they are going to operate. I don't want these borders to be opened and closed on demand, and be opened on demand and become a political toolbox in the hands of Turkish government. Just imagine if a border opens, trade flows, and infrastructure is built up across these borders, and one day Armenia doesn't behave and the border is closed. Armenia becomes a Gaza Strip, the second Gaza Strip. And are we ready for this? I don't think we're ready. Because when the trade flows and the infrastructure is there, and the government would think twice before saying no to demands that will be coming from Turkey. And for that to happen, we need a different kind of political environment in the country, different type of negotiations with different skill sets. So I remain quite skeptical about the prospects of normalization of relations, and it's still tied to the Azerbaijani demands and conditions, and there's a still bumpy road ahead. That when we talk about this, well, the question that you ask, of course, there's no answer to that question. But I think from a number of perspectives, after 1998, when genocide recognition has become one of the pillars of Armenian foreign policy, a lot has been achieved, but also a lot has been lost over the last 20 years. Because when you put something on your agenda, and you don't have a strategy what to do with this chain of recognitions, then it backfires. And when you're not ready to capitalize on these recognitions, at the end of the day, asking the question, what if the entire world recognizes what to do next? That begs a big question, where is your strategy? How long can you battle over the recognitions in this country, in one country or another? In some places, some parliaments and countries have recognized the genocide a number of times, more than once. So, but it's a different kind of question, and today's topic is a little bit different. I'm sure during the classes we'll have time to discuss these points. Yes, there is a term even which was coined by Berk Esen in Turkey, which is called Erdoganism. It's a clear, established term in Turkey, also in academia. Erdoganism has its definition. It's a subtype of competitive authoritarianism, where the regimes get re-elected by creating the smokescreen of elections, competitive elections, but in reality, it's a subtype of authoritarianism with a clear vision and mission. What kind of society and polity Erdogan and his company want to create. So yes, there is an Erdoganism. When it comes to pan-Turanism and democratization, my perspective is a little bit different what Cengiz has been saying. I think as it stands, it looks like it is not serious, and it doesn't have a potential. But unlike many countries in our region, including Armenia, Turkey, Azerbaijan, and Central Asian countries, say Tajikistan, they have learned from the 1990s. Because in the 1990s, they learned what was working and what was not working. Turkey backpedaled, given also Russians' comeback. But now things are changing much faster. Turkey of the 1990s is a different animal than Turkey is today. And Turkey, unlike, let's say, Eurasian Economic Union that Armenia is a member of, the Turkic organization, Turkic Council of Turkic countries, is a different animal. It's a different organization. There is a great deal of ideology behind, and that ideology has a cementing effect. May not be visible nowadays, but with a weakening Russia, some scholars go as far as saying we are seeing a decline of Russia. Well, not so fast, so it takes a while for Russia to decline and to dismember. So I think we should not underestimate this council. That can have some interesting manifestations, and Armenia should be watchful. And Iran, as you see, Iran is also very sensitive, and India is very sensitive. So it's a great chain that we are witnessing. And the 47 kilometer of Armenian-Turkish border is a 47 kilometer of a border that has strategic significance going beyond going beyond our country. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Well, I don't have much to add because I basically agree with many of the points raised, but maybe let me just start by this question about pan-Turanism. And I do agree with Vahram that it's a thing in process, but it depends on how we define this pan-Turanism. In our own Armenian understanding of pan-Turanism, this is an expansionist project that Turkey is seeking to actually unify all the Turkic populations and elements of the Caucasus, of Central Asia. As things stand now, I don't think that's the project. And as Professor Akhtar said, I don't think people in Central Asia are really fond of Turks, linguistically, religiously. I mean, there are many, many differences. So the fact that when we say pan-Turanism, we automatically understand this kind of brotherhood between Turks in Turkey and Turks in Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, it's not really, it doesn't hold much weight. But it's a thing in process, and I don't really differentiated from other panisms like Pan-Arabism. And Pan-Arabism in the early 20th century, or the second half of the 20th century, was a much more cemented, was a much more mature ideology, and it didn't really turn out to be a kind of a menacing ideology.
Pan-Slavism.
Pan-Slavism.
In Russia.
I just wanted to add one thing on why is Erdogan being given the green light, just to add on what Professor Akhtar said. I think this again goes back to the issue of the security perception and the security discourse. For the most of the 20th century, the West did not really challenge the Turkish military's coups against the state when it utilized this threat perception and defining of security targets. So when Erdogan actually co-opted this discourse, it in a way legitimized his actions in Syria as well as in Iraq, specifically against the Kurds, because the West was kind of approving Turkey to defining the Kurds as a security problem. So Erdogan actually used that card and said, we cannot afford of having another Kurdish state on our border, so I will just intervene. So in that way, he was very flexible and pragmatic in using that nationalist/security discourse against the West.
Just a point that I just add to what Varek said, and the beginning of this immunity/appeasement/empowerment policy by the West, which basically says that we want to have a Turkey there, and whatever it has done before or it will do in the future, as long as this country is within our sphere of influence, we will close the eyes and we will play the three monkeys. And the beginning of this is the Lausanne Treaty. Yeah.
Or not an international term, but the spoiled brat syndrome, sort of. Yes, let's start this time from there, and this is the second and final round of questions, and yeah, we'll be going. We'll collect questions again.
Oh, okay. This is a little bit, I think, complex in my opinion, in my brain. When you say, say that 30% support for Erdogan, and you brought the example, the comparison with the Germany, and after Nazis, the Nazification of the German. I wonder if the 30% wasn't there before Erdogan. When we had Trump in America, we knew that society was there, except it wasn't tapped into. But he did, and they came ashore. And let's say if Erdogan goes, this is really comparison with the Nazification and the ideology, or is it there and it will stay?
Yeah.
So many thanks for your insights, Professor Akhtar. I want to ask two questions to you and then one question to the panel. So first, regarding to your remarks that Turkey, so NATO and United States attitude towards Turkey, given Turkey that is a NATO member. So, but what about coup? For example, a 2016 coup in Turkey is viewed as orchestrated by the United States. So, does it mean that United States or NATO are kind of indifferent what's happening in Turkey? That's the first question. So, second question, you mentioned that many different political parties in Turkey are coming together, and the main purpose is to win elections so that President Erdogan would lose. So I would like to ask, what's the main raison d'être behind that? I mean, what's the main purpose? What driving the forces to come together and so that they could win and President Erdogan would lose? What's the main reason for that? And then, third question open to the panel. So you talked a lot about history. So as you talked a lot about history, I would like to ask, so let's say if you were to identify 3 core events, given the broader Turkish history, what would be the 3 core events which have political implications till today? I mean, informing political thinking in Turkey, strategic thinking, political thinking in Turkey, driven by the long history. If you were to identify 3 core events, what would be those core events? Thank you so much.
Thank you for the great discussion once again. My question concerns about the elections. I've heard another question out there. It's about when you said that the 30%, they got the 30% of the votes. So do you think after the 2020 war, there would be this rally effect, meaning that whenever a crisis happens, whenever the war happens, the support for whenever the country wins, do you think this will improve the support towards this year's elections, or what's your thought on this? Thank you.
So thank you for your discussion. So my question refers to the three of the speakers. So I would like to know, Professor Cengiz Aktar talked about the denazification of Turkey. So if we take examples from the history, we can say that, for example, the denazification of Germany took place by force, right? The Nazification of Ukraine, as Russians insist, again takes place by force. So my question is the following: which state or states are going to denazify Turkey, and whether it is going to be by force or I don't know any other means? Because if we see the patterns in the history, they show something very interesting. I would like to hear your take on it. Thank you.
I have to remind the speakers that on Monday there is going to be another discussion. Barak is going to be running it. It's at, well, you'll get the announcement, but there's another one on Monday. It's like in one of the conference rooms. Before I give the floor, this whole thing about denazification, one of the key examples of that, I think what Ukraine and Russia is happening, that's BS. I don't think that there is anything. It's a more lexicon issue. But a very good example is the de-Baathification of Iraq. Again, by force, you're right in that sense. The difference is that when you talk about whatever it is, de-whateverization, Nazification, Baathification, it does require a lot of planning and parameters. In Yalta, people, when the leaders met about planning on what's going to happen in post-Nazi Germany, they were planning on denazification. Not that everyone who was a Nazi member had to get rid of, they had to be gotten rid of. Then, because that's what they did in Iraq. And guess what? Everyone is a member of the Ba'ath Party to get a position. So they lost a whole sort of institutions, people who work in foreign ministry, even at the directorates, even at the traffic school, and so on. So in terms of one of the things that needs to be considered here is also cultural, not necessarily by force institutional. And then, Cengiz, take it away.
Okay, these 30%, I don't remember where this came, but no, you were the last one anyhow. I think something has changed dramatically in Turkey. The population was always there, exactly. And how come they solidified, actually? They were there, but they were not allowed to talk. The Islam was not allowed to show itself in the public sphere. I think the most symbolic, the biggest symbol of it is the headscarf. The headscarf in the public offices, it was forbidden. And with the arrival of the political Islam in power in 2002, this red line of the republic, there were two: one separatism and the other one backwardness. The separatism being the Kurds, backwardness being the Muslims. Okay, the second one is gone with the arrival of political Islam to power in a normal way. By elections, etc. So this has, Turkey in a way has rediscovered the very cement of its nation. What is Turkish nation's cement? What is the minimum denominator which constituted the Turkish nation. It's Islam, of course. This is why they have, cleansed the non-Muslims when they were creating the nation. There was no place for them in it. They couldn't think of it, and so this 30% of the solidified mass in terms of Hannah Arendt, they will remain, and they are there, and they won't go, and they are different reasons why they won't, and the one is definitely ideological. The last 200 years is, through the westernization of the Ottoman Empire, Islam was always in the, it was done against Islam in a way, starting with Mahmud II, Islam was systematically, marginalized from the very core of the state. And but with 2002, that has changed, and I think this critical mass of support for the regime feels this. If they lose the power today, I think they will never ever get back in the helm of the Turkish state, and they feel this, and this is why they are ready for everything. And this is why I feel. I'm extremely concerned about the outcome of the elections, and things may happen. And so in connection with this, what is the driving force of the opposition in to get together and to try to get rid of this regime? Frankly, as we said, and Barak mentioned the Abdulhamid era, etc. Okay, the unique driving force is to get rid of Erdogan, thinking that once Erdogan will be gone, things. The spring will come, and it will flourish everywhere, etc. It's a big mistake. There's no such a thing, and not the least because the opposition will inherit of a huge wreckage that I was describing regarding the institutional wreckage of the main institutions of the society. So this regime was there since 10 years. If you count with Erdogan, he was there as of 1994 when he became the mayor of Istanbul. Becoming mayor of Istanbul is like becoming a mayor of a big country, And so it's 30 years, and people are sick and tired of this man, of this regime, of all what he and his friends represent. Okay, this is the driving force. And when you ask what is your policy for the day after, the answer is, okay, let's get rid of him and we'll see afterwards. You cannot run a country like Turkey like this. It's impossible. And this is very worrisome. And the Turkey's, the strategic allies, who were there to excuse anything and everything to what of Erdogan doing, including the so-called coup d'etat. And that was a real coup d'etat, but it was taken over by Erdogan, apparently according to the Russian intelligence, who was shared by Ankara. And so they closed their eyes. People continue to think that it was masterminded by Washington. I don't think so. And the Turkish army has a very, good record of successful coup d'etats. They don't miss a coup d'etat like this. It was very childish in a way. That reminded me some coup d'etats in Africa. So that brings to the three major events. I would say, the three major dates. I would like to limit it to two. One is 1912, the loss of the First Balkan War. This has changed the entire paradigm in the Ottoman Empire. And this is really the real kickstart of the nationhood, or And 1912 was a major trauma for the elite of the Ottoman Empire. And many things happened, with 1912, with the loss of the First Balkan War. The entire presence in the Balkans, is gone, etc. But not only, all the chefs, who run the genocides and the pogroms afterwards, including Celal Bayar, etc. All these people started to emerge after 1912. And it was a kind of revenge. Okay, if you get rid of us and the Muslim populations of the Balkans, we will get rid of the non-Muslim populations of Anatolia. Of course, without asking any question to the non-Muslim populations of Anatolia, who had no clue about what was happening in Bulgaria at the time. We had no, cell phones at the time. So this is the first date, probably a cutoff date, really a kind of rupture, and the other one is 2013 with Erdogan recently. One is the Gezi upheavals, and he suddenly realized that people can revolt, and he was not expecting this. The next month, in July, Morsi was, kicked out in Cairo. This was a shock for Erdogan. He realized that the same thing may happen to him. And, he was not sleeping probably in those days, because Ankara was very much involved in what was happening in Morsi, Egypt. It was a kind of viceroy. The Turkish embassy has become a kind of CIA office, really running the show in Cairo, and Egyptians didn't forget this. And this is, and the third event was the corruption revelations at the end of the year in December 2013. They caught Erdogan on the way of stealing money. I mean, so this was for him the end of it, and he used everything to ensure a new power system, a paradigm where he will be control of everything and getting rid of his former ally, the Gülenists. So, and the effect of the war and the elections. There is much talk about this, Ghazi thing. I mean, I very much agree with this. The only war the Ankara has kind of indirectly won is Karabakh, actually. But they don't mention it. They don't feel it like this. And in Turkey, no. It's because Turks hardly know where it's Karabakh, and so you shouldn't ask too much to know for geography. But there was a talk, of course, of a new incursion in Syria. There was a talk about an attack on Greece, etc. I think with the earthquake and with an acute need of cash, I think all these new adventures are gone now. I mean, things. Again, we still have 1 month and a half to go, but they might. I don't know. Annexation of Northern Cyprus, for instance. This is. It's all already under control since 1974. This is a possibility, and this is an important question: how we will denazify Turkey. Of course, there's no doubt that Germany was denazified because it lost the war, and as Vahang Dadrian was saying, remember in the beginning I quoted him comparing the Armenian Genocide and the Jewish Genocide, etc. So the world has decided to stop with this immunity and go for a retribution for what the Germans have done in Germany, but also elsewhere against the Jews. So this is a new dynamic, and it is a kind of unique dynamic, actually. It didn't happen much afterwards, and especially in Central and Eastern Europe now. Mind you, all these former Soviet satellite states, they were all involved in the Holocaust. No one talks about it. And they were not asked to recon with, and no accountability there either. You know, when you ask a Pole who was living there, he will tell you, my ancestors. What ancestors? It's written in Hebraic, at the door, which is Yiddish. I mean, but with the Hebraic alphabet, and it's what are you talking about? I mean, they were Jews, 3.3 million, and no one talks about it, and it's forbidden to talk about it in Poland. By the way, there's a law, and so the only chance for Turkey was the EU process. Through the EU process, Turkey had the opportunity to recon with this past, with this very terrible and very traumatic past of, you know, what we were all describing, the ethno-religious cleansing, which is at the very foundation of the state. It could have gone through, you know, by taking the advantage of the EU process. It would go through this kind of, you know, thinking, mea culpa, and it started actually. Mind you, all this, you all know about this. I mean, what was happening with the first years of the EU process. I mean, we were having conferences on the genocide, mind you. You know, that was the first time that such a thing was happening. Not only about the genocide, but also about all the past. You know, the genie was out of the bottle. Unfortunately, the process has collapsed, and now the parenthesis is closed, but it's a real, historically missed opportunity. Sorry, I talked too much.
One thing, by the way, it's not either or, denazification, debothification. One thing that historians, especially in Central Europe and Western Europe, might know the lustration laws that they had, you know, after the Stasi and so on and so forth in Czech Republic. So there's no one size fits all. It's not that it has to be imposed. It can be if there is a true democratic state which is willing to deal with its past, which is, yeah, problematic.
Let me start with your question. So, 30% of Erdogan support. Well, you know, when I've been closely following the Turkish elections since I started to get interested in Turkey, with Turkey. So, in 2002, when Erdogan won the elections, 2002, the AK Party, there were only 10 million who voted for Erdogan, and he got only 34.6% of the votes. 10 million, 2002. During the recent elections, his supporters were more than 20 million. I mean, the ones who voted for our party or Erdogan. So within 20 years, his constituency, I mean, his supporters in the ballot boxes increased twice. 20 million of the population of 85 million was where only close to 50 million had the voting.
Exactly.
60 million who have the right to vote. That's a huge support that he has enjoyed over 20 years. And he, mind you, he has won around 18 elections and referenda over 20 years. That's a huge, huge trajectory and legacy that he has. Is it, whoever comes to power, is it going to be easy to, okay, let's assume Erdogan is defeated, he's out of politics. How about his supporters? It's exactly what happened with Saddam Hussein and others. They are gone, but not the people who supported him, who believed in his ideology. So Erdogan may be gone, but not Erdoganism. They may hang around for quite some time. So the question about three core events of Turkish history. I like this question for a number of reasons. First of all, big surprise now, when we conduct our admission interviews for graduate school, we ask the same question to our applicants. Name three core events in Armenia's recent history. So I'll gladly share my experience of. So I'll give three answers to Republican history of Turkey. To me, the first event is the Lausanne Treaty, the negotiations with that Turkey has invested so much that they spent 9 months negotiating every single sentence of that treaty. Because of that, number of negotiators have changed from Britain and from France, but not from Turkey. And Inonu was a firm supporter of Turkish position. So for me, Lausanne is number one. Second is 1935, the fourth conference of CHP that established Kemalism as a state ideology. When state and the party emerged and they became one entity, and that continued all the way until the 1980s. And the third event for me is establishment of Milli Görüş movement, which was basically the forefather of Erbakan and Erdogan, the people who led the political Islam to victory. So Milli Görüş in the late 1960s, and the creation of Turkish Islamic synthesis, which was, again, what we see now. So Milli Görüş, 1935 CHP Congress, and 1923 Lausanne Treaty. Yes, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Yes, just to wrap up with some minor points. I don't know the statistics of Erdogan's voters, but from a historian's perspective, I can say that the 30% who is, let's say, loyal to him until that, we shouldn't forget that apart from Islam that made these voters or people visible, the AKP rule, at least in the 2000s or early 2010s, also made the lives of these people much better in Anatolia, Central Anatolia, and parts that the Kemalist regime had pretty much neglected for most of the 20th century. So it's not only about ideology, it's about how people felt, how people lived their lives, and to what extent people felt attached to the state. Because if, let's say, in the 1930s, a peasant in Anatolia could not really live or leave his village, in the 2010s, someone from Kayseri can actually travel to Paris. So that's a big difference that people actually would take notice of. So I would just keep it on that. And for the question about the 3 core events, that's a tricky question because it depends on who you ask in Turkey. For the Kemalists, there's a different set of events. For followers of Erdogan, it's a different set of events. But I do agree with Baran that the Treaty of Lausanne is one of the core events because it really is the foundation of the Republic. But I'll also add 2 or 3 other events that really reverberate in Turkish society in different ways. Today, first is the Treaty of Sevr, and the fact that there's something called the Sevr syndrome in Turkey, kind of this anxiety, this fear that all of the Western powers in alliance with other small states are out there to actually partition Turkey, to divide Turkey. That's truly kind of felt anxiety by the Turkish state and even Turkish society at large. Second, I would say the meteoric rise and the meteoric fall of the Democrat Party in the 1950s and the execution of Adnan Menderes in 1960 after the coup d'etat. So that also holds a lot of weight in Turkish society, especially for Erdogan, who actually tries to rehabilitate Adnan Menderes now as a martyr that was executed by the Kemalist elites. So that's in a way to tarnish the Kemalists and the army further. And the third, I'm not sure if the other panelists would agree with this. I would actually divide it into 2 major events. This is the 1909 counter-revolution against the CUP, which is in many ways connected to the Menemen incident of 1930. So in 1909, there was a counter-revolution against the Young Turks, that basically mobilized students from the religious schools and more conservative elements of society. So that, for the Kemalist elites, was really something that could actually happen in the Republic as well. And sure enough, in 1930, in the small city of Menemen on the Aegean coast, there were some Sufis who mobilized the local population and actually beheaded a local Turkish gendarme officer So that, in a way, actually convinced the Kemalists that society is still very much attached to political Islam, and then we should actually cleanse society from its Islamic credentials. So it depends on who you ask in Turkey what those main events signify and mean for them.
Yeah, that was a tricky question. You asked for 3 dates, and then you have 3 panelists. Obviously, they're not going to agree. So that's very good, 9 dates. On April 3rd, it's from 4 to 5:30 in room 133 West for the AUA community conversation with Cengiz about, focus will be on 2023 mostly, also about probably you can ask questions about the elections and so on. Students and faculty in the UA community are more than welcome. It's in the conference room on the first floor. One final thought. From the first moment Cengiz started talking, a quote from Milan Kunderas came to my mind, and from his book, The Book of Laughter and Forgetting. It says the story of the struggle of men against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting. It's quite interesting that you also, I mean, it's not related directly, but it's also what you choose to remember and what you choose to forget in this process, which is very much part of this process. Thank you all. This has been quite an intense, I think, conversation. I think it was really sort of in-depth. We could have gone forever, but it's weekend. A lot of people want to go home already, and some of them have classes. So thank you very much. Thank you for our panelists. Thank you, Cengiz. Thank you.
Thank you.